Welcome everybody to the latest in a series of webinars on national security law issues sponsored by Columbia Law School's National Security Law Program. Today's session is an introduction to intelligence law, and I'm delighted to have my dear friend, Professor Bobby Chesney, visiting us from University of Texas, where he holds the James Baker Chair. He also directs the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Let me just say a few brief words about our topic before turning it over to Bobby. One of the big takeaways I hope you all leave this with is that intelligence, and we'll talk at the beginning of Bobby's presentation about what that is, but that intelligence is actually a highly regulated area of government functions. This wasn't always so, and intelligence has a long history going back all the way to the beginning of our republic here in the United States. Some of our founding fathers were actually some of our greatest spy masters, but most of the modern intelligence community and the law regulating it, a lot of that is an outgrowth of World War II and the Cold War. But it's wrong to think about intelligence as being an area largely devoid of law just because the activities mostly exist in the shadows. I think that's wrong, and I think I hope that'll be one of your takeaways. So why is our topic today important? Let me list a few reasons. First, we're talking about immense government powers here. We're talking about intelligence agencies that are empowered to conduct surveillance and collect vast amounts of information, to break a foreign government's law, sometimes to break international law, sometimes even to kill. So how do we hold those agencies, those government institutions in check? A second reason has to do with secrecy and invisibility. A lot of what we're going to be talking today is shielded from public view, and it's very hard to measure the success or failures of intelligence activities. So it's difficult for us to rely on the sort of standard political process to hold officials accountable for what they do and don't do. So how do we make up for that in the world of intelligence law? The third reason has to do with effectiveness. The country depends on the intelligence community to keep us safe, to advance the national interest, and we want the intelligence community to be aggressive in how it's pursuing those ends or supporting those ends. At the same time, we want rules and institutions that help assure that the job is well done, that resources are spent efficiently, and that intelligence agencies are learning from mistakes. So those are just a few of the reasons why today's topic is so important. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bobby Chesney.
Great, Matt. Thanks for having me on, and nice to see all of you virtually speaking who are participating in this. So thanks for your time today. This first session is styled as Law of the Intelligence Community Foundations, and I really mean it that way. The idea here is to begin from the premise that you may not be all that familiar even with the intelligence community itself. And so the first thing I'm going to do is begin with the roadmap here to give you a sense of what we're going to talk about. And the roadmap has the following elements to it. First of all, I'm going to unpack exactly what I'm treating as in scope for this discussion. As we're going to see in a minute, people have varied ideas about what are we talking about if we say we're talking about the regulation by law of intelligence activities. So which activities are we referring to exactly? Then we'll have a who's who in the zoo segment. We'll go over some of the key institutions. Matt and I already have been referring to the intelligence community, or the IC as it's often abbreviated. But what exactly is that referring to, and which institutions of the US government are the key players? Then we'll turn to a third foundational element, and that is to call to the surface the major tensions, which Matt has already drawn your attention to, these key tensions both domestically and internationally, in having institutions that perform these kinds of functions in a society that we style as free and open and subject to the rule of law, and indeed promoting the rule of law in the global order. So we're gonna highlight those tensions and observe how they arise. And then last, we'll provide the ultimate foundational element, which is a general survey of the different slices of law or species of law that are relevant, and in what ways are they relevant in terms of providing an overarching legal architecture for this set of activities. And as always, when we talk about the legal architectures of any government activities, we're talking about rules that both constrain and enable, that both limit and corral, but also facilitate and make possible the performance of certain functions. So that's the whole name of the game, is to design an optimal legal architecture in light of all these tensions that arise, bearing in mind which institutions we have or could have, and which activities we are actually trying to have, and towards what larger government purposes. So there you go. Let's dive right in with the discussion of which activities count. Now, as I said earlier, people have some wild ideas sometimes about what exactly it is that counts as an intelligence activity. And we have Hollywood to thank or blame for some of the confusion. Although I've chosen a James Bond image, I probably should have gone with the most confusing example of all is this Will Smith movie. I think it may even be called National Security. I forget the name, but the agency in question is the NSA, our nation's premier signals intelligence collection agency. But according to the movie, as they chase down Will Smith, they seem to primarily be a domestic, almost covert action agency. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Point being, there are a lot of different things that could be intelligence activities, and we need to be clear about in the US system, when we talk about the IC and the intelligence community, what exactly do we, should we imagine is going on? And I think the best way to come to grips with that is to start by observing that it really doesn't begin with the institutions of the intelligence community so much as it does with their customers. By customers, we're talking not about private sector entities, obviously. We're talking about the leaders of the US government, starting with the President of the United States and extending to cabinet secretaries and various others with what we might characterize as national intelligence needs. The customers are the ones who ultimately are the persons setting objectives and seeking certain services from certain agencies. And those services, when it comes to intelligence, really can be grouped into two buckets. First of all, you've got services that could be described as informing the customer's decision-making. And I'll talk more about that in a second here. By informing, we're talking about a set of activities, sometimes grouped under the heading the intelligence cycle. And the idea is you begin with what the customers identify as the things they need to know about, what their requirements are. And every year, there's a complex, highly bureaucratized process of nominating and vetting and deciding upon at both high levels of generality and narrow granular levels of specificity, what these needs are. What is it that we expect our intelligence agencies to go out there and get so as to help the customers make decisions? So the planning, direction, needs, and requirements part of the cycle comes from the customers. That dictates to the agencies what they're going to go out and acquire, and we call that collection. Collections are shorthand for an essential activity closely intertwined with the idea of espionage or simply spying. This is gathering information. Once it's gathered, that information has to be collated, distilled, data mined, you name it. It has to be processed in some way that makes it useful to a different set of individuals within the intelligence community, the analysts. Think of these as the band of scholars of all shapes and sizes, what they are expert in. They're taking the grist that comes into the mill and they're turning it into a useful product. And so analysis then is followed by actually conveying that product back to the customers. And I want to emphasize this because it's a part that gets skipped a lot in light of the sexiness of collection, and even analysis is pretty obviously important. But all that collection and analysis comes to naught if the fruits of the analysis cannot effectively and clearly be put in front of the right decision makers. And let's face it, the headlines are often filled these days with examples of how important that can be. I will note here the ongoing controversy surrounding whether the intelligence community in recent months has identified the possibility that Russia, through its GRU organization, military intelligence, was paying bounties for the lives of US soldiers in Afghanistan. And if so, whether that was or was not effectively communicated to the president or other officials. The headlines are full of controversy about this, and that's in large part about the dissemination stage. But notice that this cycle is a recurring cycle. The fruits of collection become analysis, which hopefully gets conveyed to the decision makers, who are the customers, who then have modifications over time to their needs and requirements, and so on around the horn. All of that is the bread and butter of intelligence. And if intelligence agencies are doing anything, presumably, if nothing else, they're collecting and analyzing and disseminating the fruits of intelligence. But here's where it gets complicated, and here's where the James Bond reference comes in, because if you think about all the James Bond movies and books, yes, some of it is stealing secrets. Occasionally, he's got the little camera taking pictures of stuff. But more often than not, he's not so much collecting things as doing things. And of course, in a James Bond movie, the doing is always dramatic, a little bit over the top, highly kinetic. Doesn't have to be. He could be doing more boring things. And real intelligence agencies, when they're doing things instead of just collecting and analyzing things, well, it's not always as exciting as a James Bond movie, but sometimes it is. What are we talking about when we talk about an intelligence activity that is not collecting information, but is instead, or collecting intelligence, but is instead doing things? Well, if it's an intelligence agency doing it, it's probably covert action. And in our second segment today, in our next class or lecture, we're going to go really deep into the ins and outs of covert action. But here, I'll simply note that covert action, in the US system at least, is defined to be a circumstance in which the US government is attempting to influence events, be they political, military, economic, attempting to cause effects outside the United States, abroad, where the sponsoring role of the United States government is not intended to be apparent or acknowledged. That's what makes it covert. The effect itself might be very visible, might be a drone strike, for example, but the sponsoring role of the United States is not going to be acknowledged. That's what makes it covert. And so you have this fundamental divide between the informing process, where customers are being served by the intelligence community through its efforts to collect information, to analyze it, and to provide useful knowledge, news you can use to the customers, and the distinct, though sometimes intertwined, processes of actually trying to cause effects overseas. You can have a robust intelligence community that only does the intelligence informational part of this, that doesn't do things, doesn't conduct covert action. It's a policy choice we make to have the covert action tool. You don't have to have it all. But then again, you don't have to have any of this. And maybe in a bit, we'll talk about why do we do this? We're a rule of law, free and open society. Why do we have these mechanisms? But before we dive into that, let me provide a little more foundational, what are we talking about type knowledge by zeroing in on the informing function and spelling it out in terms of collection and analysis. And what I want to do here is draw your attention to the idea that there's various paradigms of information gathering that government agencies can engage in. One of them is the quest to know what we need to know under the heading of foreign intelligence. Let me begin by emphasizing the foreign adjective there, the word foreign. It isn't talking about where is the activity taking place. It's talking about what's the subject matter of the activity. You can acquire foreign intelligence in Montana as well as Moscow if there's something afoot in Montana that pertains to foreign entities and their, well, what? Their motives, their capabilities, their intentions, data about what they are doing, all sorts of aspects of foreign entities, be they individuals, non-state actors, foreign governments. The key is that they're not domestic, they're not American. That's the what of foreign intelligence. Why? Why do we want to know these sorts of things? Well, it's probably pretty obvious at a high level of generality, but let me spell it out a bit. Obviously, there are any number of national interests at stake that would be better served if the decision makers in our government had an improved understanding of all sorts of things, many of which fall under the heading of threats, whether they be traditional military threats, non-state actors in terrorism threats, counterproliferation threats, transnational organized crime, cybersecurity threats these days, or never lose sight of this one, counterintelligence threats, because everyone else has these agencies and they're doing their work trying to pry secrets out of the United States, or conducting covert action in the United States, as the Russians like to remind us. They don't have to be in the nature of threats. And I feel like this is one of the misconceptions that we've been left with from our deep focus on threat activity in the post 9/11 period. But intelligence, including foreign intelligence, is hardly limited to understanding what the threats are. Sometimes it's not so much about threats as about less exigent matters, such as just diplomatic negotiations, trade disputes, what's happening with migration, what's happening with technical advances elsewhere in the world that might be significant for the future of America's overall position in the world. Think about COVID-19 research, for example. And by the way, I'm not suggesting by highlighting these areas of possible foreign intelligence interests that any particular effort to steal any particular secret is necessarily the right thing to do in a given circumstance. But in the abstract, these are examples of how broad the foreign intelligence net might be cast. And we need to bear in mind too that foreign intelligence is only one possible form of intelligence. If intelligence is just a shorthand way of describing things government officials might like to know that would help them better inform their decision making, well, it's certainly in theory could also materialize domestically. There could be an entirely domestic set of activities and interest that are relevant for government decision makers to know. And as far as open sources are available to the government, and there's information that all of us can gather by watching the news, reading social media, caveat there, be careful with that one, and otherwise gathering information, then in a certain sense, of course, domestic intelligence goes on all the time. But what we really care about, of course, is whether or not the government should or does have an institution that's a domestic intelligence agency in the more spy sense of it. That is,
yeah, Bobby.
Yes.
Yeah,
Matt.
I was going to jump in actually on that point, and you may be getting to this, but one question is, why doesn't the United States have a dedicated domestic intelligence agency the way that a lot of other countries, including a lot of other democracies, do? That's not to say that we have no agencies that do some domestic intelligence activities. The FBI has a big intelligence function, but its primary one is a federal law enforcement agency. The Department of Homeland Security has intelligence functions, but it's an operational agency. We don't have, an MI5, like the British model of a dedicated domestic intelligence agency. Why is that?
Exactly. So rule of law countries that have a great deal in common, including their interest in protecting liberty and being a free society, vary on this. Some, as you noted, like the UK, do have dedicated domestic intelligence agencies. The United States really doesn't. Now, it's complicated. Let me just thumbnail sketch the history here. If you go back into the 20th century, you'll find that the FBI, in fact, functioned both as a full-on law enforcement agency and, as it does today, and as you noted, also simultaneously an intelligence agency, the domestically based intelligence agency, both for purposes of collecting domestically on foreign intelligence topics and targets, but also for pure domestic intelligence purposes. And that blew up in a deeply controversial way, especially in the early to mid 1970s. A series of revelations. I think a lot of listeners, this would sort of resonate if I said revelations about J. Edgar Hoover's long directorship of the FBI and the extent to which He was using the FBI, and the FBI was charged with and expected by at least some presidents to go out and collect on purely domestic threats, not for law enforcement purposes as such, but for informational decision-making, informing purposes. The more it became clear to the public in the 1970s that this was going on, and the more it became clear that in some instances this was done in a politically suppressive way to suppress political dissent, and how contrary to our democratic values and the values of a free society that turned out to be, the more you can appreciate perhaps that the whole topic of domestic intelligence in the American experience became taboo, became toxic. And given that you still have, to this day, the FBI able to play the domestic foreign intelligence role as opposed to the purely domestic intelligence role, and given that regular law enforcement investigation activities ends up covering much of the ground that domestic intelligence otherwise might, but in a more transparent, more likely to end up being tested in court sort of way, it's easy to see how that combination led the United States effectively to abandon the idea of having an institutional commitment and a full embrace of doing pure domestic intelligence. So yeah, you could have all the same sorts of topics and interests purely domestically. We don't do that. We no longer do that. We had it for a number of decades. We have not had that since the 70s. What we have instead is we have foreign intelligence, sometimes conducted domestically, in which case the FBI is lead agency, and we have federal law enforcement along with state and local law enforcement. It's just that these things kind of blur into one another. But the key point, Matt, is no domestic intelligence as such. When we talk about the intelligence role of the FBI, we're talking about its foreign intelligence role. And that contrasts sharply with countries that didn't experience, like the UK, did not experience the same historical sequence of events. MI5 was never delegitimized or made toxic in that way. And from that perspective, I think our British friends would say, you know, there's something to be said for a model in which you do get some of the benefits of that sort of dedicated intelligence gathering, and you keep it entirely separate from the agencies that have arrest power. So MI5 doesn't have arrest power, and so it was never like the way that the older FBI was. And there are clearly some advantages to that as well. But our particular history leads us not to go down that path. So one final bit of background under this initial introductory heading. It's always worth noting when we're talking about intelligence collection that there are distinct disciplines or modes of collection that are very much bread and butter ways of describing intelligence activity within the intelligence community. For example, when you're collecting information, you're getting it from a human source. That's human intelligence or humans. Signals intelligence, think about what the NSA, the National Security Agency, does. That's SIGINT. But there are lots of INTs, lots of them. There's IMINT or imagery intelligence. You get geospatial, you have others. I just want to flag here how important open source intelligence has become in recent years. This has been a long-term trend, but boy, is it accelerated. These days, there is so much information of value because of the overall growth, the avalanche of information in the digital realm, that the insights one can glean from really sophisticated and patient parsing of open sources have not only approached, but in many instances equaled, perhaps even exceeded what traditionally could be accomplished by a government intelligence agency that was in the business of stealing secrets. There are private sector entities like Bellingcat that can accomplish extraordinary things without having to do anything along the lines of what an espionage agency can do. So don't lose sight of the importance of OSINT, or open source intelligence. Now, those are the activities that count. We've got collection activities and analysis related to that. And then we have the doing of things, or covert action. Let's talk about who's who in the zoo in the American IC, or Intelligence Committee. It's often described as being a cohort of, depending on how you count this, 16 or 17 separate U.S. government agencies, which have an an overall community existence, a shared mission, and some elements of common governance, and thus the idea of an intelligence community rather than a single intelligence department. Now, you may be wondering, does this work like, oh, I don't know, the NFL? You know, the NFL has a whole bunch of constituent components, plus an overarching agency with some degree of control. I don't think it's a great analogy because in the NFL, those independent owners, the teams, they're obviously hotly competitive with one another. And though the components of the U.S. intelligence agency can be competitive too, it's not quite the same thing. Is it maybe more like General Electric, like GE, where there's a unity of mission, lots of different component parts that are doing very different things, but it's all clearly one mission with some ultimate board of directors and CEO clearly in charge? No, it's not that unified. It's maybe somewhere best described as being in between. Let me give you the cast of key players in a way that I think will highlight just how complex it is. You might even think of it as a group of 17 entities involving some big dogs and some smaller dogs. The Pentagon's a big dog, and a number of the intelligence community agencies that are out there are part of the Pentagon. You've got Defense Intelligence Agency and the NSA, aforementioned NSA. But you've also got the NGA and the NRO. My God, there's a lot of different agencies. And then we throw in the various intelligence services of the traditional service branches. That gets you 8 separate entities that are all ultimately reporting upwards through the Undersecretary for Intelligence and then on to the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense in our system is a very big dog indeed. But then there's a number of agencies that are not part of the Defense Department. All the rest of it, not part of DOD. The Central Intelligence Agency stands alone as a civilian independent agency. And the director of the CIA, of course, is another very big dog. And then you've got a bunch of agencies that are embedded within still other departments. You've got agencies, multiple aspects of DOJ, for example. So in the Justice Department, on the org chart, you've got the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Agency. Homeland Security, as Matt mentioned, has its intelligence component. The Coast Guard does. Energy does. The State Department has a small but robust analysis shop. Treasury, for obvious reasons, does. When you distill this down and try to get a picture on who are the big players in light of all this, you'd be remiss if you didn't pause to note that for the past decade and a half, we've also had a somewhat overarching layer in the form of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI. And on top of all that, though it's not in any formal sense part of the intelligence community, it is the ultimate customer, the president, and by extension of the president, the apparatus within the White House structure, and more specifically the National Security Council, which always includes a senior director to help manage the interagency engagement and the engagement of the president's own interest and the White House's policy commitments and perhaps sometimes political interest with all of this. What a stew! I mean, from that perspective, we're approaching 18, 19 separate power centers.
Yeah, Bobby. So how a critic would look at this and say this is horribly inefficient. There's a lot of overlap, redundancy. This seems unnecessarily complex as an organizational map. What's the logic for having so many distinct intelligence agencies?
Right. So I'll give you 2 answers. One is this is history. It's not academia. It's not the ivory tower. So we can't draw it up sort of in a blue sky way and make it all happen from the ground up in a perfectly designed way. Inevitably, history will cause pieces to come into being in a particular moment where a particular institution has an interest, and bureaucratic politics being what it is, that will be preserved over time and not being sucked away into some centralizing new institution. But then that's not a good enough answer, because if that were the only answer, we'd say, all right, we need to work against that and figure out where it's inefficient and unwise. There's a wisdom in it as well, a twofold wisdom, I would argue. First of all, and this goes back to the larger theme of how do we feel about having institutions that are going to engage in these sorts of activities, at least the more controversial ones. Analysis is not a controversy, but collection and covert action certainly are. How do we feel about having them in a rule of law society? Well, in keeping with the larger American approach to how do you have effective government institutions across a range of capabilities without them becoming too dangerous to the body politic, you break up the institutions, you distribute power, you have checks and you have balances, and there's a form of checks and balances existing in this multi-layered big dogs and little dogs, multiple institutions format. Just taking analysis, the chart I've got up here encompasses an array of different analytic institutions, helps avoid groupthink, helps ensure that there will be dissenting opinions, that there'll be different perspectives being brought to bear. That in itself is a great value. Separate from checking these institutions, though, the other value, the other wisdom built into this is the wisdom of specialization and the ability to focus on particular needs. So when it comes to human and another collection that's of special interest to the US military and how it's preparing for potential adversaries and how it's fighting current adversaries, there's a lot to be said for having a defense intelligence agency that can focus its efforts very expertly and with a wholehearted commitment born from being within the Pentagon on those equities. It's not that CIA can't do a good job if only CIA can do that human collection, but CIA has got to serve the national priorities as well beyond what the military may need. And why not have both then? As long as you have larger systems in place that can deconflict them effectively and you have the resources to support them. I will say here, it's worth pausing to note, the United States is nearly unique in its ability to devote the kinds of resources that are needed to make all this possible. Even our Five Eyes partners, very, very few circumstances in which they can devote this sort of overlapping, duplicative approach to things. So we get some benefit from that as well. So moving on, let me just flag who the biggest institutional players end up being in this model. So of course, the Director of National Intelligence matters a great deal, but the Secretary of Defense is in no way subordinate to the Director of National Intelligence. Their authorities are going to overlap here to a certain extent, and the influence and importance of the Pentagon vis-a-vis the 8 elements of the IC that are part of the Defense Department, well, I'd say that's pretty powerful, even relative to the DNI. The CIA director, a power unto herself for sure, Director Haspel. And then I would elevate at the same level the FBI director and the Attorney General. Both have their roles to play and in complex ways, as we've learned in recent years, are their own power centers, which is not to say that the other heads of the agencies aren't very important. The NSA director, General Nakasone, also a very important individual, but these are maybe the biggest dogs in the institutional structure. And interestingly, they have different relations with Congress, right? The DNI and the DNI looking to Congress is very much looking to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees as the core jurisdictional committees. But of course, the Secretary of Defense is thinking about armed services. The CIA director is looking to the intelligence committees, but the FBI director and Attorney General are looking to the judiciary committees. And this, I think, highlights in one slide the real sort of bureaucratic and power politics complexity of the IC. It's not efficient. This isn't an efficient way to run the oversight. It's not an efficient way to distribute the power, but it may be very wise. I'm not so sure about the oversight, at least, but I think the power distribution on the agency sides, for the reasons I said below, or said a moment ago, may be wise. But let's jump from that to talking about how do we feel about this set of institutions doing the things I mentioned earlier? How do we feel about how that sits in a democratic and free society that champions the rule of law domestically and in the world? Clearly, there are tensions. It'd be foolish to deny that there are tensions. There are tensions both on the domestic front and there's tensions on the international front as well. And maybe it'll help if I enumerate them. So let's talk first domestically. Where's the tension at home? Isn't this just a problem for other countries, what we're doing? How is it a tension for us ourselves? Well, several possibilities. Depending on what sort of legal architecture one has and how effective it is at corralling what the intelligence community does, you certainly could see some manifestations at home. And those manifestations could have tremendous rights or liberty impacts. So the fact that one might think, well, that's not really a problem at home, that bespeaks certain assumptions about how effective the architecture is about keeping the intelligence community entirely outwardly directed. And maybe we don't want it to be outwardly directed entirely, for as I noted earlier, foreign intelligence collection priorities manifest within the United States too. Perhaps some of the most dangerous ones from a counterterrorism perspective, some of the most important ones from a, well, let's just think about Russian activities in the United States or Chinese activities, and you can see the counterintelligence ramifications. And so there does need to be some things that happen at home, and therefore we need to really keep an eye on the rights and liberty aspects of those activities. What else? As Matt said at the outset, one of the overarching themes that pervades this area is the dilemma that arises because these activities inherently need secrecy to be most effective, or perhaps to be effective at all. But if it's secret, then how do you have democratic accountability? How can we feel like this part of what our government does reflects the will of the people in some sort of larger democratic sense that's central to who we think we are as a society? Simply put, transparency has to be limited to some extent for this set of activities to occur, but that necessarily gives rise to a very serious risk of a democratic accountability deficit in how this part of our government operates. And then on top of all that, there's the specter that you might have a deeper rule of law problem insofar as the system were to allow these activities to actually violate domestic law, to violate American law. Now, let me quickly say one of the key takeaways when we get to the legal architecture is that's not permitted. That's actually a central plank of our approach to handling all these tensions, is to require intelligence community activities to comply fully with American law. Notice I said American law. We're going to get to the distinctions in a moment. But if you don't have that principle, or if you do have it, but you don't effectively enforce it, then you have maybe the deepest domestic problem of all, domestic law breaking. That's the domestic front. What about the international front? Well, we have a similar triptych. We've got reputational risk, right? The United States engages in these activities. It will come out. It will end up on the front page of the New York Times sooner or later. That seems to be the never learned but constantly retaught lesson of the past several decades, is that this stuff comes out. That can be costly to the reputation of the United States, and therefore costly to national power insofar as it erodes soft power, or maybe costly in more particular instances. So the diplomatic blowback risk and the long-term reputational risk for engaging in certain types of activity kind of depends on what the activity is, how much risk there is. If it's run-of-the-mill espionage directed at foreign rivals' military capabilities, finding out the United States is spying on the Russian military, that's not really going to give rise to reputational risk. If anything, failing to be doing that and having people think you're not minding the store in that respect might be more reputational risk. But especially when you pivot over to covert action or forms of collection activity that aren't so obviously justified, well, those things can have real cost internationally. What about the possibility that the United States becomes perceived as eroding rather than championing the idea of a rules-based international order? That, at least for some of us, that's a high priority national interest. And so if exposés of what we're doing undermines pursuit of that interest, that's a cost that ought to be taken into account. And then there's the impacts on those who are abroad. So in a moment ago, when I was talking about the impacts at home, I began with rights and liberty impacts. And I pointed out how, look, you have to mind the store here, but a lot of this activity is foreign directed. And the implication of saying it that way was as if, therefore, anything goes. Who cares what happens? Well, people who live elsewhere who are affected by these activities care. And actually, so do a lot of Americans who bring more of a human rights universalist perspective, or what we might call a more cosmopolitan, treating everyone as within the circle of persons whose rights need to be respected in certain ways. Opinion's very complicated in this respect, but you can gain a lot when you look at debates about our overseas collection and covert action activities, if you bear in mind that the people with whom you might be engaging, maybe the authors of articles you're reading or people you're arguing with, people who maybe have different views than you do, be alert to the possibility that you and that person or that author have different premises about whose rights are most important to be respected. One or the other of you may have a highly nation-specific conception, sort of a, the United States should worry about US persons, should not worry about persons in other countries. The other person may have a very universalist approach that has a different view of that. And that helps explain a lot of the crosstalk and the shouting past one another that goes on, including, for example, in the aftermath of the Snowden controversies in 2013.
Yeah, Bobby, I just wanted to jump in on that and maybe put the tension a different way. If the United States is intent, as it is and should be, on protecting its basic institutional freedoms and form of government at home, and if it's going to be a force for good in the world, both in terms of supplying security, but also advancing democracy, we call on our intelligence communities, our intelligence agencies to do a lot. And one of the big questions, it seems, is how aggressive do we want them to be? Sometimes we've wanted them to be very aggressive and even take the gloves off with regard to certain activities or certain partners that they might work with abroad. And that often involves making a certain sort of moral compromise that in order to advance certain interests, we may have to we may have to make certain compromises along the way. The history of intelligence law in some ways is written as a swinging pendulum here between asking the intelligence community to be more aggressive, putting a lot of pressure on it to do everything it can to, let's say, undermine communism or combat terrorism, and then awakening through processes that you'll talk about later on to realize actually that crosses a line that we're not comfortable with, and try to figure out where do we draw a line. So I see one of the real tensions here as being how aggressive do we want our intelligence agencies to be?
Boy, that's so true. I think that many a movie has a moment where some parent or adult tells a teenager at a key moment, it's time you learn that life's not fair and things aren't going to necessarily work the way you want. And you sometimes hear in conversations with people from within the intelligence community that they often have learned historically the hard way that they're going to be held to an unfair standard in the following very specific sense. The country writ large, and that is the customers, are going to demand for it to act a certain way, to accomplish certain things, as you say, in the name of counterterrorism or anti-communism, whatever the current paradigm may be. And failure, where it looks like the intelligence community didn't spot the problem or misanalyzed something or otherwise couldn't execute the activity that was supposed to be activated, they'll be held to account for not being good enough, aggressive enough, capable enough, not doing more. And yet it's equally true that however unfair it may later on seem to be, that if and when some of these activities that take place in the shadows, when they see the light of day, there's no guarantee that the public and therefore the politicians won't blast them for what they're doing, even if the politicians perhaps knew at the time, or some of them did. It's an inherently unenviable task. They've got to be right every time, and they've got to be prepared to take a lot of the blame for what goes on. And sometimes they earn the blame. No institution's perfect, and there are plenty of examples where intelligence institutions have made mistakes. And it's not just that they were told to go do something, and then when it became public, they were left hanging. But there is this sort of sense that the pendulum swings, as you say, from a time of great anxiety. And by the way, in our covert action discussion in the next class, I'm going to bring this out very specifically. Moments of national anxiety about international affairs and threats. There's going to be pressure to do more, be aggressive, get chalk on the cleats. And then there come these moments, especially where it's been some time since the activating moment, where things come out and there's a lot of criticism for what they've been doing. So bearing that in mind, let's jump in to see. So what are the pieces of the legal framework that's meant to corral and constrain yet enable all these things? So let's survey the legal architecture. And this is meant to be not a specific discussion of particular provisions for the most part. It's really meant to just help people maybe who are new to this area to understand where the different pieces fit in. We're going to fly through this pretty quick. Start at the top, the domestic legal system, and the top is the Constitution. Constitution is basically going to do two things. It's going to give us rules that separate powers between the executive branch and Congress, and it's going to give us individual rights protections that have certain protections for certain categories of people. Mapping that out really quickly, let's talk about the structural limits. This is the separation of powers stuff. The questions that matter here are whether there are some things that Congress must affirmatively authorize, or if instead the ability to do these various foreign intelligence collection activities and covert action activities, even if Congress were silent, is that authority still there? Maybe more interestingly, once Congress has intervened and there are statutes, is the executive branch stuck with the results of that, or does it have some ability to override any of that? On the individual rights front, we do have a number of relevant individual rights: your life and liberty protected under the Fifth Amendment, your certain aspects of privacy interests protected under the Fourth Amendment. But who gets the benefit? U.S. citizens and lawfully present persons in various complex ways, what I will collectively call U.S. persons. U.S. persons clearly get the benefit, definitely when they're in the United States, and then in complex ways when they're outside the United States. But in our system, constitutional rights, and this is a kind of a controversial evolving area, but the core idea is that they're not applicable to non-U.S. citizens or non-U.S. persons who are outside the United States. Vladimir Putin has no Fourth Amendment rights in Moscow. So you must always ask first, who are we impacting? And then you can ask about whether life, liberty, or privacy interests have unconstitutionally been impacted. Below the level of the Constitution, you got federal statutes galore. Some of them are generally applicable. Some of them are about specific agencies, and they fill in a lot of the space that the Constitution does not. And as we go through this pyramid, as we get further and further down, we find more and more law or rules. At the top of the pyramid of the Constitution, there's not much. With statutes, there's some. What kind of things do the statutes do? In the American system, U.S. government entities have, they fetishize, have an obsession with the question of what is my agency's affirmative authority to act? What are our missions? What are the things we're supposed to be doing? Doesn't have to be that way. That's not the British way, for example. There's more of an assumption there that the government has sort of the government can act unless it's told it can't act. But in our system, whether you're talking about the CIA or the FBI or any particular entity, you're always keeping one eye on what are the marching orders, what's the lane for that agency, and statutes sometimes spell that out. They don't spell it out for everybody, interestingly. It's spelled out for CIA. It's not spelled out in statute as such for NSA, in contrast. Once you know what you're supposed to be doing, what your missions are, whether it's coming from statute or otherwise, then there are questions about whether statutes set some boundaries, some things thou shalt not do. These are also describable as just substantive constraints. Separately, statutes can manage decision-making processes and require transparency either with the public or with Congress. Statutes can even create institutions and embed them within the intelligence community's various agencies that are in a watchdog capacity. So we hear a lot about inspectors general, and that's an incredibly important area, as we've learned in recent years, if we didn't already know it. But there are also offices of civil liberties or offices for privacy protection. Again, in general counsel's offices, of course, compliance officers. Those are an array of different types of offices of goodness, as has been said in scholarly literature, that protect against accidental or purposeful violation of the rules that are out there, and more generally can combine with these other mechanisms to create incentives for agencies to realize that even if not everyone will know what they're doing all the time, somebody will know about it some of the time, and a lot may know about it eventually. That's the theory goes, that will create a healthy environment for not being too aggressive when the pressures are, as Matt said, to be quite aggressive. Now, below that threshold, we've gone.
Bobby, can we just pause there and talk? Because you mentioned the Congressional Intelligence Committees when you were discussing statutory rules. That came up earlier when you were mapping the intelligence community and how the executive branch maps on to the legislative oversight system. So can we pause and talk about the Congressional Intelligence Committees? Sort of what do they do, and what can they do? Because they've been in the news a lot in recent years. We depend on them sort of to act as a bit of a proxy in our democracy. If so much of this activity is shielded from public view because we need to protect intelligence sources and methods, the intelligence committees have a big role to play in sort of standing in for the public and perhaps pushing back on what they see from the executive branch, either doing too much or too little. What can the committees, though, actually do?
Right. You've put your finger on maybe the biggest takeaway of the whole talk, because I think that, you know, underneath all the context and descriptions and the generic statements, one can say, look, just tell me like the one thing that the legal architecture is really doing to constrain these entities. And probably the single biggest moving part is these days, though not originally, but these days, there's clear statutory requirements for when it comes to both covert action and collection of intelligence for significant intelligence activities and these types of programs to be reported to these special bodies within Congress. And so that sort of mechanism is just what you said, Matt. It's the proxy that tries to address that democratic accountability gap I described at the beginning. These activities have to take place in secret to be effective. We can't have them announced in the Federal Register. Well, how then do we have democratic accountability? Well, you can at least ensure that the nation's representatives, or, well, you could in theory have all the nation's representatives in Congress know about them. That's a lot of representatives, and perhaps the downside of that would be way too much risk of leaking or inappropriate disclosures that might have been well-intentioned by the person who disclosed them to the public or took some action against them that disrupted the activity, but maybe wasn't actually a good judgment on their part. So to balance this idea that we want to have some kind of oversight by Congress to close this accountability gap, without it becoming a free-for-all where everybody in Congress knows all the secrets all the time, and therefore they're constantly leaking out. We've created, since the 1970s, we've had a mechanism where select committees, both in the Senate and the House, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, known as SSCI, SSCI, and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, known as HPSCI, HPSCI, yes. They are the selected groups, and in a good government sort of ideal sense, the idea would be is that these entities, unlike your run-of-the-mill committees, will have a little bit more of a spirit, or a lot more of a spirit of bipartisanship, common mission, and good government functionality, and that they might escape some of the partisan public, perhaps partisan serving interests that maybe characterize other committees. It has varied over time, to put it mildly, how far from the paradigm SSCI and HPSCI have actually been in their functioning. They've had their good times, they've had their bad times in this respect. We're probably at a less functional time today than in decades past. But the idea is that by keeping information flowing to them, at least some select representatives of the people who have different political accountability and different interests, including a different partisan commitment on the part of half of them, are in position to know what's going on. So what can they do? Well, it depends on their particular appetite for leveraging the tools available to them. Sort of at the most extreme, they can out things. members of Congress are protected by the speech and debate clause of the Constitution, and though they are in a variety of ways committed not to disclosing classified information, they're legally protected from certain forms of accountability, the most serious ones, if they were to go to the floor of the Senate or the House and start discussing what they have learned, in order, which they might do precisely in order to derail something that they think is wrong that is happening. That's extremely rare. What is perhaps less rare, and people fight very hard over whether this happens a lot or very little. There's the possibility of instead covertly, to borrow a phrase, leaking to the media, or having a staff member who does so, or a cutout who does so. Those are sort of the extreme examples of taking an action when something's disclosed that a member is deeply concerned about. Much more realistic would be pressure on the appropriations process for a given committee, pressure on or leverage over nominations, who's going to get confirmed in the Senate, or simply hauling people before the committee to demand answers, to browbeat them, et cetera, which can happen at the formal level of hearings with officials being, high-ranking officials being brought in. It can also happen, and happens much more routinely, in sort of the day-to-day of staff-to-staff level engagements, where the people in the intelligence community whose job it is to come keep the intelligence community informed in particular ways, have constant back and forth dialogues where the general idea is that Congress is pulling for more information. The staff is from their perspective trying to give them that information, or from the congressional perspective, perhaps trying to hide the information. They, it depends on who you're talking to, how they characterize the process. But there's a spectrum of possibilities there. And of course, there's also the possibility that what people learn in Congress may then materialize in new legislative constraints. So all these tools are out there. They're obviously very, very hard, most of them, to be used at an individual level. But that just goes back to the question of, well, how problematic is what they're learning? The idea is not to constantly cause problems for the things that the intelligence community is doing. One hopes that the intelligence community is generally doing what it's supposed to be doing, and that the knowledge that Congress, through these committees, will have at least some visibility into what's going on, that things will out to them, will help them make better decisions on the front end, so that they don't make the sort of decisions you might, erring maybe too much on the aggressive or wild side, thinking that no one's ever going to know what you're doing anyways. Completing the run of types of law that regulate what's going on here, there's also a really critical zone here that's at the level of executive orders and other forms of presidential decision directives and documents. So the things that the president may direct be done or shall not be done, they're not law for you and me, but they might as well be law for everyone within the executive branch. These are binding in that sense. So not formally speaking law, but it's law-like for the executive branch. Of course, there's a complication, or a pro and a con, a bug and a feature. Executive orders, from the positive perspective, have great flexibility. The president creates them, the president can amend them, create exceptions to them, replace them, et cetera, repeal them. That's great, flexible, adapts over time. Also means they're not sticky and they're not binding in the same way. And if there's some rule you like that one president has embedded in an executive order, and then another president comes along, that president's not going to be bound by it if they really don't want to be. It's not entirely cost-free for the subsequent president to repeal that earlier rule, but it's very much doable as compared to trying to get out from under a statute. You can do all sorts of things with directives. You can spell out which agencies are going to have which affirmative authorities. You can't necessarily expand or alter and undermine what a statutory list of affirmative authorities are. There's some complexities there, but it's tricky to do that. But for things that do not have a statutory charter, this is where the affirmative authorities are going to come from. It's where the president will convey that directive. You can issue directives. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. You can create more transparency, et cetera. Let me talk here about the granddaddy of them all, because no discussion of the legal architecture of the intelligence community is complete without referencing 12333. That's the number of an executive order issued by Ronald Reagan. Wasn't actually the original executive order of this kind, We go back to President Ford and then President Carter. President Reagan's executive order was an updating and expansion of what Ford and Carter had previously issued. But it remains in President Bush, George W. Bush later on would amend it further, but we always call it 12333. It basically it looks a little bit like a statute. It's sort of an organic act filling in where statutes didn't. The presidents over time, their consecutive perspectives on which agencies of the IC should have which lead roles. Where necessary, it spells out their affirmative authorities. It contains some shalt not. It specifies some general policy principles. And the slides here kind of map out how this works. It opens with goals and general principles. It then enumerates agency by agency by agency, talking about each official head of agencies, duties and authorities. It has some limits on collection activities, some limits on covert action. We're going to get to that in the next lecture. I'm just flagging it for now. And then it supplies some oversight and transparency rules because there's some overlap here with the statutory framework, but this is sort of an overlay on top of that. And so when you hear people talk about 12333, they're technically referring to this executive order, but it's been adopted and extended over time. I'll just note that sometimes it's used as a separate idea. It's a shorthand way of referring to foreign intelligence collection activities that are not subject to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, but that don't have that kind of U.S. nexus, and they're directed outwards at foreign targets and taking place outside the United States. Those kinds of activities are sometimes described as 12333 collection, but just don't make the mistake of thinking 12333 is entirely about that particular set of activities. Now, I'll just note quickly, every department and agency head, the DNI, the Secretary of Defense, the NSA director, the CIA director, they've all got their own sets of departmental rules and regulations. And if you're in any of these agencies, you think about the rules that bind you, this is where all the detailed granular action is. And again, those rules aren't law for you and me as outsiders, but they function as law for the agencies themselves.
Bobby, can I jump in there? Because, you know, I know you're about to turn in conclusion to talking about some international law constraints and how international law intersects with this. But just to close out the discussion of domestic law, we've been talking about intelligence law for an hour, and not once have you mentioned courts, at least I don't recall. So what are we to make of that? Are we talking about a body of law that is almost all a matter of the political branches, or do you see courts as playing a significant role in regulating intelligence activities?
So it's really interesting how this has changed over time. Historically, courts had no role in any of this, historically. Since the 70s, which was really an inflection point in our legal and policy history in many respects, since the 70s, the courts have had an extensive role, one that made the United States, from a rule of law, oversight, constraint perspective, path-breaking amongst all countries. When you're talking about collection activities that had a strong U.S. nexus, either because of who the target of the collection was, if it's a U.S. person, or because the means of collection had a strong U.S. territorial nexus. It gets a little complicated, but we suddenly, from 1978 onwards, with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, entered into this world where we continue to have a courtless approach to most collection and covert action activity. It's all over there and outside the purview of courts, and certainly not the subject of litigation. And then suddenly a highly judicially engaged, albeit in its own unique ways, but a judicially engaged set of collection activities right there in the United States. So that would be an example of where a statute can create both shalt nots and transparency and oversight and decision-making rules in a big way. What's interesting now is that, you know, several decades on, with ever more awareness and in recent years, lots of anxiety about intelligence activities, pendulum swings, as you described earlier, there's been both a migration of what the public understands about what collection activities can entail and how in our current high-tech information environment with the internet and the peculiar way that information is traveling and is stored, how the foreign domestic divide has gotten so indeterminate in some cases and irrelevant, especially with respect to data storage in other respects, although not entirely, that there's extended pressure to have the courts sphere reach outward further than it perhaps used to be. Then there are those who say that it's imperative that happen. And then of course that there's a countervailing argument that no, that's going to bring with it oversight and good rule of law and accountability values, but at the cost of disrupting efficiency and efficacy values at too great an extent. And so that's one of the major battle lines that have been drawn in our current legal architecture, for sure.
Right.
We'll talk about that more.
I think I've only left you about 5 minutes to talk about international law, which is itself a very American approach to intelligence law, right?
It's so true.
So let me let you finish.
All right. It's actually, it's very fitting because the legal architecture, one of the big takeaways here is that we've got a thick legal architecture in the way I just described for domestic law, and it's exceedingly thin when it comes to international law. And this is a point of friction with many of our closest allies who have at least to some extent, different conception. It works like this. International law can be broken down very roughly into treaties and to custom. When it comes to treaties, you have highly relevant treaties like the UN Charter in particular. In fact, that's what I'm thinking of here, that are about the protection of state sovereign interest in various respects. So the prohibition on armed attack and use of force. There's some dispute about whether the UN Charter can and should be viewed as embodying some sort of broader sovereignty protection that precludes espionage and collection activities within their territory. As you and I have often talked about, certainly the US government's view, and I think our view is that espionage is not a violation of the UN Charter, that state practice is so overwhelmingly to do it that you can't powerfully make that claim, and ditto for customary international law. Covert actions, where the rubber hits the road here. Covert action can be entirely non-kinetic and innocuous to highly kinetic and highly strategically significant. It can be any number of things on that spectrum. It's certainly possible in theory for a covert action to rise to the level of an armed attack. And so the UN Charter does have a role to play there at the level of what are the United States legal obligations. As we're going to see in our next section, when we talk in depth about this, talking about covert action, America has a complicated approach that has the effect of paving the way for the possibility of legally, under American law, engaging in a covert action that will violate international law. Again, we're going to go into that in detail in the next segment. For now, I'll just flag it as an issue that's a covert action issue, doesn't really arrive for most collection activity. Never mind state sovereignty protection. What about protecting people and their individual interest? Human rights law and international humanitarian law, where you have armed conflict, they protect people. And again, you can have situations where something that is done as an intelligence activity perhaps is lawful under US domestic law, but might put the United States in violation of its treaty obligations. That possibility is mitigated by a series of doctrines that are embraced by the US government, controversial doctrines, including the idea that our treaty obligations under, say, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the ICCPR, a major human rights treaty, the US government's position that it does not necessarily travel with us overseas. It applies within US territory, but doesn't apply when US agents are operating elsewhere in the world. If you have armed conflict, the lex specialis idea that the law of armed conflict is the specialty law that governs in that circumstance, perhaps displacing any contrary rule of human rights law that might otherwise apply. And then finally, this idea that I think of as the last word, this idea that even if something is a violation of international law, that doesn't mean it's the last word on legality, for as I adverted to a moment ago, as we'll talk about in the next segment more, there's a way that the US government approaches covert action in particular that treats the question of international law violation as relevant for sure, but not the last word. And that's probably a good place to stop, because we can extend all that to customary international law, but I think that actually just muddies the water, and maybe we can squeeze in a final question or two before we terminate for our break.
Yeah, Bobby, let me just ask one final question. You already touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious, as you've studied not just US intelligence law, but also studied it from a comparative perspective, and you talked a bit about how it operates in other jurisdictions, including other democracies. Are there some aspects of intelligence law that you could highlight as being sort of distinctly American? Are there some ways that you would characterize US law in this area that you think are different?
I think that historically, go back 10 years, and I would have said we have far more, we certainly, when it comes to collection activity that impacts US person privacy interests, the interests of our own people, we have a far more transparent system, both in terms of what the legislative members know and where the courts have involvement. Now, that's changed in recent years. A number of our European allies have moved along very far in this dimension. Some would even say that, I'm thinking here of a recent German court decision. If anything, they're beginning to surpass us in a way that really might gum up the works for the efficacy of some of their collection capabilities and their ability to cooperate with other countries as well. So we're no longer sort of the pace setter, but we're clearly out there very far when it comes to protecting vis-a-vis our own persons. Where we differ from them and have less claim to fame, if it's fame, is with respect to the protection of the interest of persons outside the United States and persons who we would describe as foreign persons abroad. Our system does not traditionally prioritize protection of their privacy interests, which is the name of the ball game here. That changed a little bit after the Snowden revelations. President Obama adopted a few policy constraints as a matter of presidential directive that at least look to elevate the privacy interest of foreign persons, but perhaps not as far as in practice as it might otherwise seem. But we are also leakier and have a far more robust ecosystem of private sector and journalist entities. So I'm thinking of NGOs, advocacy groups, and journalists who watchdog the US intelligence community, who dig, who find out, and who expose, and who rally public opinion to criticize things that maybe sometimes they shouldn't, but very often they should. And other countries have this as well, but I don't know that anyone's is as robust as ours. So from a certain perspective, I guess it boils down to this. We have the most robust intelligence capabilities, but we also have the most robust system. So we're capable of excesses, but also great achievements. And we're also capable of exposés and revelations to a degree probably that's not true for most of our allies. And by the way, is certainly not remotely true, not even 1% for major adversaries, Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia.
Thanks, Bobby. That's a perfect note to end on.